Good morning. Good morning. And a warm welcome to this, the first of the monthly talks hosted by the Friends of the QV Mag. The theme, if you've been before, is Our People and Their Stories. This is a very special story this morning, and I can't claim to be unbiased. The purple badge denotes the fact that I'm not only chairing the meeting this morning, but I'm also a very proud member, albeit a newbie, of the Tatlers group. Before we start, to begin, we, the Friends of the QV Mag, acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and locally the Stony Creek peoples, as the first inhabitants of the nation and the traditional custodians of the lands and waters where we live, learn and work. We honour their culture and knowledges with deep sincerity. Today, we're going to learn about the life and work of the Tatlers. This enduring group of Northern Tasmanian women's writers is about to reach pensionable age. It turns 60 this year. And perhaps you read a little of their history in the Sunday Examiner, a full-page article, which was a marvellous statement and recognition of this very, very special group. Well, no retirement plans with this group. Ongoing recruitment has sustained the group's outputs and vitality. I'm a newbie in the group and can speak from personal experience of my very deep respect for the Tatlers, their mission, and the members of the group, most notably the commitment of members to serious writing and shared community. There are 12 current members. Not all can join us today, but apart from our speakers, whom I will introduce in a moment, seated in the audience, we have Anne Carr, we have Justine Vaughan. Please stand. Can you stand, ladies? Anne Carr, Justine Vaughan, and Patience Stewart. Patience, a wonderful poet, storyteller, narrative writer. Justine, a wonderful writer of imaginaries and images of near and far. And Anne, also a wonderful creative writer. Very, very special writers and members of the group, and long been members, unlike myself. So please welcome the Tatlers for this, our first of the series for 2022, our March talk for Our Peoples and Their Stories. And I'd like to hand over now to the first of the speakers, Jan Frost. Now, just before I do, let me tell you a little bit about our three speakers. Jan is the current president of Tatlers. She joined 25 years ago. That's an amazing commitment. And is a fifth-generation Tasmanian. She's published 7 books, several of which are Tasmanian nature studies. Nancy Corbett, sitting in front of me here, is our secretary. Nancy came to Australia from Canada in 1974 and has lived in Launceston for the past 12 years. Both her novels and her poetry have won prizes and been shortlisted for major events. Nancy is quite a noted poet, and some of her books you may be familiar with. And then Susan Aykut, sitting in the middle here. Susan is our archivist and an historian who joined Tatlers in 2012. She's taught at universities of Melbourne, Monash and La Trobe, and published and presented work on Ottoman history and Orientalist art. So please welcome our speakers. And now I'll hand over to Jan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret, for that introduction. And I'd also like to say that Margaret is one of our members now, and she has said, oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, I forgot. I am a teacher, so I thought you probably could hear me. Or I was a teacher, I'm not anymore. But we're very lucky that Margaret has decided to join us too, and we're very fortunate that to have her amongst our numbers. Now, I'm going to tell you some of the history of the writers this afternoon. Tatlers Women Writers of Tasmania started in 1962. It was started by a lady who came over from South Australia. Her name was Pip Horner. She was a member of a similar group in South Australia where she had been one of the formation members there of a women's group of writers, because back in those days there were only male groups of writers and they would not let women join, or at least that was so in South Australia. I believe it was probably quite likely here too. Anyway, Pip arrived in Launceston with her husband and decided that she liked the idea of writing and what she was doing in South Australia, really wanted to continue here. So she was fortunate enough to work with some teachers at Launceston Grammar at the time and other women who were housewives and really were just being housewives and doing the things that housewives did back in those days. And they were friends, a lot of them, got together and started another group of writers, which they also called Tatlers. Women just about then were starting to emerge from the household and do other things, go back to studying. Some of them wanted to be more financially secure, so they went back to work, etc. And others, just like a lot of our members now, simply wanted to try their hand at writing once again. And so they started a group very formally back in those days. The chair at the person was Meg Howroyd, and some people may remember her. Margaret Dowse was another Launcestonian who went to school here, and she was on the committee. Molly Campbell-Smith was also a member, a very prominent lady in Launceston for many, many years. They got going in this group, and some people, of course, stayed in the group. They decided they liked to write and they wanted to continue. Others dropped by the wayside. And one of the things about our continuity is the fact that we have had a fluctuating membership over the years. It's provided a source of an injection really, and a source of new blood into our society, and it allows people to bring with them their ideas, etc. So not everyone stayed the course. There are no original members left now, but we do have a couple of people. There are. That's exactly what we want to hear. Now, do remind me what your name was. Joy. Oh, Joy, of course, yes. Joy's work is in this, our first volume that we printed in after 40 years of people being members. There was a collection work. I was just going to say to you that we were lucky that the initial people in Joy's time, they actually made very formal minutes and notes of meetings. Everything was documented very, very much in the way that things were done back then. There was nothing slapdash about it. So we have ideal records right back from the very first meeting. And you'll remember that that was the case back then. These minutes, of course, have formed our archive. They've been very important to us throughout the years. If we didn't have them, of course, we wouldn't be able to probably be as organised as we are now, although to begin with there was not much organisation in the way they were kept. They were simply kept when I got them, much later when I joined in the 1995. They were all in a leather bag and they had been handed on from secretary to secretary for ages and ages. And of course the bag was bursting and we didn't know what to do with them. And we thought, well, do we just burn these papers? Well, no, we didn't, and that was a very good thing too. We started to keep them in a box, and at the end of the 1990s, we asked the members then, or they suggested that there was so much material that we should try to do something with it. And when we looked back through the records, we found that in 1985, the members back then, I'm not sure whether you remember then, Joy, or not, but they did produce a paper pamphlet called Tatlers Together. Were you a member back then?
Yes, I have 3 of the original.
Excellent. Our archivist, Susan Aykut, there would be probably speaking to you at some stage.
Don't leave without me, please.
We have one copy which is in the archive, but that's wonderful. Luckily, we had a member who was, she wasn't an initial member, but she had a copy and could give us that some time ago. Anyway, we collected the members at the time decided to try and organise these papers. 40 years of papers, a lot of were handwritten, scrubbed out. Some were typed and scrubbed out. Some were, well, there was not much else really, but mostly handwritten in biro. I don't think there were too many pencil, but some of them had been written at the kitchen sink, you could see that. And we decided that we'd try and organise them well. A subcommittee of 4 of us took 4 years to get these papers in order. We met once a week to do it, to get them in order with the idea of making a book at the end of that time. It took a lot of work. They had to be typed up, read and whatever by more than one member of our organisation. In fact, in the end, we had to get into groups and read them all so that we could choose appropriate pieces to go into our book. And this was published in 2002, and we called it an inspired pursuit, which we thought that's exactly what it was. You wouldn't be doing it unless you were inspired and it was your pursuit. Because writing, those of you who write will know, it's a craft that you have to practice. It doesn't just come out of the blue. It's nice to think I can write a book. Well, yes, we all could, but give it a go and you'll find that it's not that easy. Anyway, we were lucky enough at that time to have Campbell McKnight, who was out at UTAS, a lecturer out there, who had a passion for northern Tasmania, and Campbell was collecting a series of, making a series of books, which he called An Historical Survey of Northern Tasmania. And we are number 8 in his survey. We were produced by Karuta Press, which was his, which he then organised and he also edited this book. So that was our first anthology of collected work, and that was published in 2002. Our memberships continued to change, of course. People came and went, and we decided only less than 10 years, not quite 10 years later, that we'd had enough material again to produce another book. So an Inspired Pursuit Volume 2 was produced and done and actually published in 2011. And that's only 5 years of writing. And you'll notice that it's as big as the 40 years, but we didn't publish all the 40 years of work because we didn't have it all, actually. Some of it was never kept, and that's sad because there was a load of treasures there from the beginning that was never kept. But once they kept it, of course, we had some records to go on. And that was really fortunate that they did keep some of their work because, to begin with, I don't think much of it was kept at all. And then we understand that you voted for the pieces to be collected at the end of a year. Is that correct?
No, we were given a title. We had 3 members give a paper at each meeting.
Yes.
During that meeting, a vote was taken.
So you voted at each meeting. We still have the title. We still write to a theme, the same as you did. The Constitution as it stood there has been changed, but it's very similar. We still write to a theme. There are at least 3 to 4 writers every time, but we keep every piece now. I thought, or I was of the understanding that you only collected them all at the end of the year, but we've actually got that little bit wrong. So, yeah, thank you for correcting that. Okay, so so only 1 from each meeting was then collected. So there was nowhere near as many pieces as we have now. Okay, I need to move on to the next slide. Right, I've talked about, now the third book is this one, In Pursuit of Tasmania, and that was published in 2020, and this one we wrote specifically. Everything else in the books, as Joy has said, we wrote to a theme during the monthly meetings. Thank you. During the monthly meetings. But this one we wrote to a theme because Tasmania was becoming very, very popular back at the end of the 90s, and we decided that not a lot of the personal history, family history and stories of the local things had been written about very much. They might have been in the paper from time to time, not collected and certainly not together in a book. So we set about over 2 years with our members writing about Tasmania. And the result is In Pursuit of Tasmania. And again, it has all those family histories. It's written in all sorts of ways. The genre's never been specified. You can write poetry, fiction, non-fiction, memoir, some archival work. You can research. You can write in any way that you want to when you come to join us as members. We don't prescribe anything in particular. So all we want is for you to come, or for people to write with us in what we think is a very supportive and encouraging group. We don't criticise people's writing. We learn from each other as we write. And of course, if you listen long enough, you will learn a lot about how to write and express yourself. So that's really what we did back in those early days. Sorry, well, you know me, that's me. Nancy Corbett, we've introduced. Susan is our archivist, we've introduced. Patricia Petit, who's not here this morning, is one of our members, has been for quite some time. Terry Sullivan has been a member back, maybe in your day, Joy. Terry was one of the first members. She's still a member. She had a gap in between her membership where she raised some children and did other things, but she's been back with us now for about, the last 20-odd years. Justine Vaughan, we've talked about Justine. She's also very much on the art scene. I'll just tell you that Justine was one of our... at the time of this, when this was launched, we used the West Tamar Art Society as the venue, and Justine runs the Art Society. Exeter Art Studio. Sorry about that. Exeter Art Studio. And this book was launched by the Mayor of West Tamar, Christine Holmdale. The first one, I forgot to tell you, this one, when it was launched by Janie Finlay, who was the Mayor of Launceston at the time, and it was done in this room. And this one too was launched in this room by our long-standing member, Molly Campbell-Smith, back in the day when that one was launched. That's just it. Patience Stewart-Gibb, we've introduced. Rain Snuff, sorry. Margaret Robertson. Sandra Ryan. Sandra can't be here today, unfortunately. She's come to join us from Canberra. She lives at Georgetown, so we're spread out. Anne Carr, local person, and you've met Anne this morning. Anu Mickelson, she lives in Melbourne now, but was a member for quite some time. Jenny McPherson also lives in Melbourne. She was a member for quite some time too. They both still provide work for us. They like to write and present, and we talk to them by Zoom at our meetings. So we have included people who have lived in northern Tasmania. Right, we began in 1962. There it is. That's what 1962 looked like. That was the Women's Weekly back then, and that's just when our members were emerging, or the foundation members. They may not have quite met in Tupperware groups, but it was a bit like that maybe, I don't know. Women were dressed in that way, and they were just about walking out and reading naughty books like Lady Chatterley's Lover. They couldn't drink in bars yet, but they soon did. And of course, Germaine Greer, she started sort of, the women's movement, which was important at the time, very important. And while we didn't concentrate on any of that, I think we've got her to thank for a whole lot of things that have happened in a women's world today. That's like a lot of the writing we've got in the archive. And the archive is held here in the QV Mag archive. We are a living archive for them because we still put work into the archive on a regular basis. And Susan will talk to you about that soon. This is what sometimes our readers look like. Susan, we talked about her Turkish connection. She's got a very elegant outfit on there. Patience is studious. And Marla was a member for quite some time. She now lives in Queensland. Joan Webb, Betsy St. Dewan and Anne Carr on that one. Sadly, we lost both Joan Webb and Betsy in the last 18 or so months. And I think we stop there because I think Nancy's going to take over from me now. Thank you for listening, and I hope...
Hello everyone, I'm Nancy Corbett, and wonderful to hear a bit about the history of Tatlers, women writers of northern Tasmania. I arrived in Tasmania after I finished working full-time on the mainland, and I had never lived in a place where so much was done by women volunteers. It's just amazing. I think Launceston would come to a dead stop if it wasn't for people that are in the room and others like us. People are proud of Launceston and northern Tasmania, and rightly so. And I arrived not knowing anyone except my partner, Howard, who I moved here with. I did not know a soul. And one of the stories in this book about my coming to Tasmania is called The Whaling Bench. Some of you may know a tiny park on York Street that has one, possibly two, seats in it and a tree, a magnolia tree. And I sat on that bench and I wailed. I felt at 67 or so, that I was too old to move again, to make another start in a place I didn't know, where I didn't know any people. And I said, as I wailed, if I died tomorrow, there would be no one at my funeral. That was 12 years ago, and I have never had so many good friends as I do today. And I have never had so much encouragement as a writer. And I owe that to a couple of organizations, and Tatlers is very much one of them. As Jen was saying, we encourage you, if you are a member, to write in whatever form you like. We have brilliant, funny short story writers. We have poets. We have people who do research into history, write essays with footnotes, and others who just let their imagination go. Children's books, too. So among us, we have a wide, wide range of people. And from the things that Margaret said at the beginning, you would think that we were a rather elite group, and we're not. We are a group of women coming from all kinds of backgrounds. All we really share is a love of writing and a love of Tasmania, and a real commitment to each other as writers and creative people living here. In the book In Pursuit of Tasmania, which was published in 2020, it's divided into 3 sections. And one of the first section is History of Tasmania. And I learned so much as a new arrival in Tasmania. I learned so much. Susan Aykut grew up in the Fingal Valley, and she has written a number of stories that are in here about the characters and history of the Fingal Valley. Other people have written about other parts of Tasmania. Jan Frost, who's a 5th-generation Tasmanian, wrote about what it was like going to school all those years ago in Launceston, and a very, very different world. Justine Vaughan wrote about Henry Reed and up at Swan Point and his adventure there before he became such an important part of Launceston's history. So I sat there editing with Jan and with another woman, Patricia Patet, who's in our group, reading all these stories again. I had heard them at the meetings. I was reading them again, and I was getting a first-hand course in Tasmanian history. Betsy St. Dewan, who died earlier, has her stories of growing up in King Island And how fascinating was that? 80 years ago in King Island, what it was like to live there. These are valuable, priceless stories that are part of the history of Tasmania that are now kept in the archives of Tatlers women writers. And I'm so proud to be a part of that. And before I go on anymore, I would like to introduce Patience Stewart, who has written the first piece that is in this book. It's called Tasmania. It's a poem, and I'm going to ask her to come around here where there's a step. Can you? I will. And read us her poem, Tasmania.
Tasmania. Tasmania, the dewdrop at the end of Australia's nose, or a love heart hanging from her sleeve, part of that great dry land, but not so, claiming her heritage from Antarctica rather than her worn, tired cousin Victoria. Tasmania, mature like a fine wine, if tasted a sip would be sharp and tangy, reflecting the mountain dew from Pelion, where Pelion, Mount Ossa, and Mount Olympia catch the scudding clouds on their craggy tips, where ice and snow whisper across the ground, finding cracks and crannies to poke cold fingers in, shearing the sharp-smelling granite for its base to fall as scree or boulder country, to be trodden by many feet, forming rolling stones that gather vibrant orange moss. While the green button grass plains shadows flicker like old films around the many-pooled earth, reflecting the passing weather passively. Tasmania, where fine food and wine combine, rows of curving vineyards thrown like scatter rugs across the rolling, fertile coastal fringe, where rosé, Chardonnay, Pinot, and Champagne grapes absorb the warm southern sun as it passes by, picked, crushed, and tasted, nectar of the gods. Rich volcanic soils grow grass grazed by indolent cows. Their rich, creamy milk turns to cheese, mixed with crops of truffles, raspberries, and other exotic fruits. All of these find their way to line a dish fit for a king. Fish flicker in the clean, cool waters around their coastline. Abalone, scallops, oysters cling to their cold seabirds among the green kelp forests. Picnic at a table, look out on the golden sandy beaches, watching the sea rolling surf pound, while out in the bay the right whales beach on their way to the colder, krill-filled feeding grounds in Antarctic waters. Tasmania, where artists and writers collaborate to sing of the beauty that exists in its curving rivers that rush through the gorges, cutting their way through to the sea. Silent, ancient rainforests grow in the south, where giant trees tower looking for light, reaching up to the sun to feed their powerhouse, while down below their moss-covered roots contort, seeking entrance into the rich humus-ridden ground where scrabbling insects work, breaking down the piles of leaves, giving food and moisture to these old trees. Tasmania, where my grandchildren play in the muted colours of the bush, shrieking with joy as they follow my laughing dogs, nose skimming the wattle-seeded ground, seeking wallaby, echidna, wombat, looking out for a soaring eagle, or listening to the kookaburra's call. Even in my garden, 5 fat bronzewings peck the discarded seeds from my caged bird, grateful for their freedoms, while mocking my bird's flight. Tasmania, the mostly ignored but hidden gem of Australia.
Thank you very much, Patience. This was at the 2002 launch of Volume 1 of An Inspired Pursuit, We have Terry Sullivan, Betsy Thane-Jewin, Jan Frost, and Anne Leighton Bennett. And at the launch of this one in 2020, we at the Exeter Arts Studio, which Justine managed to organize through getting a grant and so on and setting it up, and congratulations to you for that very, very important work, with Christine Holmdel at the Exeter Arts Studio. That was a lovely day. Also at the Exeter Arts Studio. And our afternoon teas are legendary. I'm not saying we're competitive, but some people, and I'm looking at you, Justine, tend to put us all in the shade. The last one, I think, was probably worth some kind of a prize. It was just the best ever. Wonderful thing about women's groups. You always get something good to eat. Yes, Joy.
I'd like to know that in the original Constitution, it laid down that no more than 2 kinds of biscuits.
Oh, and I wonder why that was left off later. And one thing that we can't overstress, the social aspect, the friendships, the things that we do together, like today, for example. I mean, these are wonderful things that bring us close, and we love sharing the work, and we love sharing, the results of the work. It's a wonderful thing. And I think you can see from the looks on the faces that, everyone's having a good time, and that is so often the case. A lot of those good times take place in Susan Aykut's wonderful house, where there's always great bunches of flowers and beautiful crystal and all kinds of wonderful things, and good food. And we help clean up afterwards. Jenny McPherson and Anu Mickelson, who join us via Skype or Zoom. I was meant to change that. I'm sorry, we're Zoom. And they write papers for us, and they listen to us read our papers. So they're still members of the group, even though they've deserted to the Big Island. Another thing that we've done, which is part of our engagement with the larger community, is to we've had 40 monthly programs between 2015 and 2018, which Tatlers members reading from their own work for an hour's programming. And then in 2021, we had a special series of 4 programs just based on reading stories from In Pursuit of Tasmania. And that's an ongoing kind of a thing which we'll probably do more of as time goes by, because it's a wonderful way to reach people who are not able to be part of the group or who'd like to listen to good stories on the radio. And finally, 2082, another 60 years. I won't be here. I don't think I'll be here. Will Tatlers still exist? And what form will it take if it does? I mean, already we have, technology that we didn't have before. When we were doing the editing and so on of this, we did a lot of it ourselves. The picture on the front is by one of our members from their dining room. It was a picture of the Tamar River. But whatever happens, whether it continues or whether it continues and changes form, there will be this archive of women's writing from 1962 onward, which is a treasure trove of local histories, which we would not have otherwise. I mentioned Betsy Thane-Jewin's stories of her childhood in King Island. Those things cannot be replicated. Those either are authentic or they're not. And they are authentic regional history, and they are there for everyone to access here at the QE Mag. And now I'll turn over to Susan, who's our archivist.
Thank you.
Well, Well, I'm not sure what's left to say because there's been a lot mentioned about the archives by Jan and Nancy. That's fine. I never run out of words. It's whether it'll be about archives. That's what remains to be seen. But I actually love the way Nancy introduced herself, you know, as how she came to Tasmania and how she joined the group. And I think that's really pertinent to this conversation that we're having about Tatlers, or reminiscing about it, because there have been 85 women who've been part of this group in its 60 years, and they've come from lots of different places. As you've heard, Patience has an English accent, Nancy's from Canada, Jan is a long-term Tasmanian. I arrived in Tassie when I was 2, but I was gone for about 40 years, and I came back in 2011 to spend the last 14 months of my father's life, well, to spend it with him. And I kind of forgot to go home. That's what I said for many, many years. Oh, I've forgotten to go home. Actually, I've just come back from my other home on Monday night. And it was one of those things that I thought, well, what do I do in the time that I was here with my father, etc.? And it was thanks to Betsy, who lived up the road from Dad. And there's all these lovely family connections, of course. You know, my brothers went to school with her son and da-da-da. So she said, oh, you should come and join Tatlers. And while you're here, because I was going home, don't forget. And it's actually through that process of joining Tatlers that I've realised I am home. Which is why I turned away from my former research on Turkey and came back to Tasmania, which is a bit bizarre, but there you go. I realised that there was, say, an interesting story, lots of interesting stories to tell about the state that I came from, that I realised I knew so little about. And like Nancy, those stories that we hear from all our members at the meetings are quite extraordinary. Sometimes they're absolutely exceptional, the insights, the way they're told, and they're a joy to listen to. And as Joy said, you know, the group started with a theme. Every month there would be a theme. It would be set every 12 months, you'd have various themes, and designated writers would write to that theme. The diversity of subjects, which is why we probably keep all those stories now, because they can't really be compared, even though they might be on the colour yellow, for instance. Where people go with that is kind of amazing and very, very different, because the diversity of the writers and their experiences are very, very different. And what makes this group exceptional is its bonds of friendship with each other, and the fact that, as we've mentioned all throughout this talk, there's been a record kept. And that's pretty exceptional, because keeping record for women is not something that's been commonplace. And prior to doing this talk today, we met up with the archivist here, John Addison, to just say, well, why is our archive special to the QV Mag history collection? And he said, and it was no surprise, but it was actually good to have it clarified, it's because there's actually not a lot of women's records in the archive. Women's perspectives and women's voices, as we know in history, are not well documented, there's been a big redress from the women's movements to change that, to keep women's voices in front and centre. So, when we were talking, I did have to laugh, and I've made the collection here, and I don't know if you understand about the collection, is the Community History Archive series. That's what we are part of. The first deposit that we made for Tatlers was in 2002, after the first publication of An Inspired Pursuit, because it had all been collected. There was so much work that was done by that group to put all that material together, and there was a lot of it. What were we going to do with it? So the archive was approached, or the history room was approached, to say, could we, would you collect this? Which they have done. There's been another 2 deposits made in the last 2 decades. So we're actually up to date till 2019. From 2019, the papers and all the minutes and all the hard copies of everything are under my bed. Well, not quite, but they're in my house still. So that's extraordinary, and they will stay here in northern Tasmania, because a lot of archives have actually gone down to Hobart if they are considered state relevant, rather than just the northern Tasmanian history, but because this is particularly northern Tasmania, even though we write about all of Tasmania and far beyond. You saw Anu in our slides. Anu is originally from Estonia, so she writes histories about her heritage from that part of the world. So people bring an extraordinary thing though. You saw photos of Marla reading what I think is an absolute tour de force on Indira Gandhi. She's written an entire volume on the life of Indira Gandhi in verse. An extraordinary work that she felt Indira was channeling her to write, and it's really magnificent. So the incredible diversity of stuff that comes. Sorry, did you want to ask me something?
Excuse me, I'd like to say we have an appointment. Thank you very much for a wonderful, wonderful morning, and I'll check back soon.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
It was wonderful. See you next time.
Okay, bye. So our archive is here. As I said, it's a wonderful social history because of the variety of things that we write about, and it's got an extraordinary breadth to that. And look, the things that are in this history collection are really fascinating. You could go and read something weird and wacky like the Budgerigar and Caged Bird Appreciation Society. Did you know their minutes are kept here? I don't know how often people come to read those, but I do know that people have actually accessed some of our material. Again, it's a bit like our writing. It's a bit eclectic to know what people have used it for, but the hard copies of the papers, well, obviously the best way to read them is in its published form because it's kind of neat and tidy. But for people wanting, and as an historian, I know people's footnotes are my gold, they're my stepping stones to the worlds that I want to uncover, or the questions that intrigue me. And there are lots of things in the archive that we have that I'm sure would be very interesting, even just in the minutes, the fact that the minutes have been kept for 60 years, which is an extraordinary thing given that this was a group of women who were writing around kitchen tables, and a lot of us still do. Obviously, we have computers to make life a bit easier, and we've got digital copies as well. So my job as the archivist is to hound everybody after a meeting to say, right, send me a digital copy of your paper as well as having given me a hard copy at the meetings. And then they all get sent out digitally to members so that they can reread them, because we get a bit carried away in our meetings. And of course, we've got that cake, sandwiches. I'm sorry, we really, really have departed from that 2 packets of biscuits big time, because we take our eating seriously. And of course, that's the time we catch up. And so sometimes we don't have enough time. We used to meet in the evenings, but now we find that actually a lunch meet or after lunch meeting on a Sunday afternoon is the way to go. It suits people, for those who are still working or whatever, not to have to be out and about. And we do go to Georgetown or to Swan Point. We do travel around to each other's homes. So our meetings are still in each other's homes and everything. Oh, yeah, well, that does restrict the membership, yes, of how many we can actually have at any time, because we've actually got to have, seats for everybody to sit down on and be comfortable, and not everybody's houses will take a huge amount of or volume of people. Okay, so Jan's just pointing out another reason why it's not that we're not open to membership, but, being too big makes it harder as well to keep that kind of friendly insightfulness that we get as being a small group and being connected to each other, I suppose. So I don't know if that's sufficient to tell you about the archives, but as I said, it is and again, another important thing about this, for a lot of people who, it's like an oral history collection, but of course it's more crafted in that it's written and it's worked and it's reworked to be delivered. Sometimes it's not reworked, it's just blah, and we deliver it because we're on the run. But, the beauty of we read our papers out to each other at the meetings, and again, that's another advantage of a small group where people are not potentially comfortable about reading to an audience. that a few people who are friends is fine to do. And that's a wonderful way to test your work, to hear it out loud, to think, oh God, should be more apostrophes here or, commas here and blah, blah, blah. So you can actually see in the reading how to improve a piece of work. So we do take the art of writing very seriously, but it is the storytelling that's probably most important for us, to actually think, yeah, I've got actually something to say about that, and I'm going to put it down, and even if it's just for my own edification, that's in itself a valuable exercise to do, because so often those fleeting stories we lose and we don't have... there's many times I think of things, mid-international flight when we could do such things. I'd have wonderful stories ticking over in my head thinking, yep, must write that, must capture this moment of these weird human beings I've met on these various airport stops throughout the journey. And the moment goes and I haven't got them anymore, and I think, oh gosh, I wish I'd done that. And I thought, I've got a couple of minutes to kind of anchor what this is. Patience has read her beautiful poem to you. I wanted to read something which is actually in our last book, and I don't know why, it's actually a story of Anne Carr's that I'm selecting to read. Are you happy for me to do that? It's not very long, because that's another thing. We do have a limit to the amount of words that we write at a meeting because we've got to deliver them, and there's often 3 or 4 papers given. You okay for me to do that? Okay. It's called Flight to Flinders. And I think why I think this story suggested itself for this particular event is that it's a little bit fanciful in its storytelling. It's one of those ephemeral moments in one respect, but it's about friendship. It's about a lot of the things that I think captures Tatlers. Flinders Island, jewel of the Furneaux Group, last resting place of so many. A friend, Jan and I, are flying to attend a memorial service. Usually a solemn occasion, but here I am far from solemn and unable to hide it. Seems wrong, but then again, the flight is a gift, given so we can attend a celebration for the life of a very dear friend. It's not a funeral. The cause of the unseemly behaviour is first sight of what we're about to take off in. It looks like the size of a biscuit tin. The adrenaline is pumping. The heart is thumping. The tiny plane looking smaller by the minute. The pilot, in shorts, looks barely out of school. The whole thing has a look of a stonkingly good adventure, and I can't keep the grin off my face, so I stop trying. The flight is from Bridport, on the northeast coast of Tasmania, to Lady Barron, a tiny landing strip on Flinders Island. It's the mail plane we're about to board, a single engine, 5-seater, with just enough room for a few passengers, a pilot and some freight. They tell me it's called an air van, just like in Caravan. Well, hell or high water, the mail must get through, so I guess we will too. There was no time for breakfast when we leapt out of bed at 6. It's an hour-long drive from Launceston. And anyway, said friend Jan, I don't want to get sick. I know what these flights can be like. All I'm worrying about is finding the place, getting there on time. 7:30am departure, on the dot. Take the Scottsdale Road just before the Bridport turn-off. Can't miss it, paddock on the left, said our host. We don't have tickets. Not a thing. It's been a word of mouth, hardly reassuring. But there it is, a spanking new shiny aluminium hangar with a small sign reading Flinders Island Aviation. We arrive in a cloud of dust and park on the grass verge, lining up with an extraordinary number of cars and a 4-wheel drives already there. A helicopter parked over yonder has its engine revving, but there's not a soul to be seen. We wander over. The hangar, in fact, is already a hive of industry. 2 chaps stacking and packing and stuffing in freight and mailbags and bundles of Tasmanian newspapers. Another is towing a twin-engined little something out of the way. We're early, stand feeling faintly foolish, until rescued by our pilot, a good-looking young man who says they're expecting us and suggests we go into the facilities upstairs. Lose, help yourself, coffee, biscuits. I go silly with my iPhone. Hanging over the mezzanine floor, videoing the busyness below. Then we're beckoned down to go through the safety procedures. For the life of me, I cannot recall what they were, but we were handed a bright yellow something which we tie about our waists. Parachutes? Water wings? It all feels surreal, especially the thought of how one would exit the cabin in an emergency, for we have the greatest difficulty managing to even enter. Legs seem to get in a tangle, and anyone a tad overweight needs to sidle up sideways, crab-like. The 2 metal let-down steps, a perfect exercise in awkwardness. A young girl and her brother join us, obviously off to the island for school holidays, he with a tiny puppy in his arms. We could only smile at one another, for the engine noise was now deafening. Puppy slept contentedly the whole way. Sitting inches behind the right shoulder of our pilot, I was following the take-off procedures intently as he tested this, pushed that, twiddled the other. Pilots have been known to pass out at controls, you know. Passengers having to take over and fly the plane. Can't be too blasé. But then it's all too exciting to care anymore. We're moving, motoring noiselessly off down a dirt track, dust flying, me peering through the tiny window in search of the runway. There isn't one. Suddenly the pilot guns it and we're racing down the paddock. I'm sorry, it's very funny, Anne. Tiny tyres bouncing like beach balls over the rough, drought-hardened earth. Engine purring reassuringly. We lift into the air with not much paddock left either, methinks. But it seems a pocket handkerchief of grass will do, which it did on the return flight when we dropped off a camper on tiny, uninhabited Passage Island. Well, not quite uninhabited. An unruly sheep shot across our bows at takeoff. It didn't seem to faze our pilot or the little air van, a workhorse of a vehicle built for aeronautical dodgems if ever there was. The views were breathtaking as we looked down at the island after island, and then roughly 35 minutes later, yes, there as promised, were Nigel and Janet, the couple delegated to meet the plane and entertain us for the morning. We had landed at Lady Barron Airfield, and it was just that, a field with an air sock and a few parked cars. Blessedly luggage-free, we piled into our host's four-wheel drive and headed down the road to White Mark and breakfast. Now, I'm conscious that we're nearly out of time, and Margaret will thump me if I'm not going to pull this into line. Exactly. I'm only halfway through this story. If you want to hear the rest of it, you're going to have to buy the book. And I didn't actually mean to do that, but that's a really good sales pitch, I think. So the books are over there. It's a great read. It's full of really some fascinating stories. And Anne, I do love that. I think it's a very funny story. Thank you very much.
Slightly hard act to follow. I think one of the things that I'm constantly realising is that the Tatlers as a group give you legitimacy to take a risk and to explore ideas. And it just amazes me the stories that are walking around our streets that we don't hear, we don't have access to. The last 2 years, the theme of the group has been travel. Now, you know, we've not been able to travel in person, but the armchair travel and vicarious experiences we've witnessed, including Justine's wonderful exploration of being confronted by the police in the middle of the night in New York and guns pointed in her direction, mistakenly, I think was one that kept us all on our toes. So there is this amazing opportunity to be creative with ideas and in a warm, supportive environment, and that's, I guess, really what all our speakers have been trying to say. So I'd like to hand over to Prue McCausland to propose our vote of thanks for our speakers.
Well, I'm sure, like me, you've all had a wonderful morning listening to the stories of the Tatlers. It's been a great experience to hear what a lovely, supportive, collegial group they are. And certainly I can imagine, as someone who was beginning wanting to write, having such a group to share their writing with and be supported in it would be a wonderful way to do it. I thank particularly Jan for her history of the group, Nancy for talking about the people and the writing that they do, and Susan for the archives and for that reading Anne's wonderful story. Would you all join with me in thanking them very much for this wonderful presentation? We congratulate you on your 60 years, and I think that 2082 is no more than should be expected. Our President, Kay Darling, has some honorary memberships for the presenters this morning. And before you go, I'd just like to remind you that our next session will be on Wednesday, the 27th of April, where the speaker will be Polly Flanagan, and her topic is 6 Proverbs, Reflections on a Life in Education. Polly grew up on the west coast of Tasmania. She loved school and always wanted to be a teacher. She's a graduate of the University of Tasmania, and her first appointment was in Queenstown. She later moved to Victoria, where she's taught in government, Catholic and independent schools. And after 40 years in education, she's returned to Tasmania, where she is leading an active retired life. She will use 6 proverbs as a lens through which she will share her educational journey, her thoughts on the changing educational landscape, her beliefs about what makes a good school and what matters most in education. So I hope you'll all come along then. It's sure to be a very enjoyable talk. Thank you very much.
I suspect it could be quite a lively talk. It's just before the federal election, so we could get some interesting debate. Now, before you move, please, we have a little time, and it would be wonderful for Joy as an original member. I think that's been one of the joyous things of today, really, is that discovery of people in our midst who have such amazing personal lives and ideas to share, and you know, this sense of belonging in this wonderful place where we live. So over in the corner here is a collection of these beautiful books, and our Tatlers members will be over there, and I'm sure if you'd like to join with them and ask questions and discuss and debate further, they would welcome that opportunity. Thank you very much for coming today.